So I'm Bob Russell, founder and director of the Center for Theology and the Natural Sciences, and the E.N.G. Barber Professor of Theology and Science here at the GTU. It's my pleasure to welcome you all today on the beginning of Holy Week. I'm grateful for you taking time out, especially Pastor Andrew. It's a busy time. The mission of the center is to promote the creative mutual interaction between theology and science. And we do it through research, teaching, and public service. And the Russell Family Fellowship really combines all three. It's obviously research, and that's what you're here to be part of with this wonderful program from Joshua Moritz. It's also public service, and we had a forum on Wednesday night that Joshua gave us, which was excellent, and of course teaching. And the resources of our research filter into our courses, doctoral and seminary courses. So it's just a wonderful combination in this one event. Given my dad's name originally, and now expanded to include my mom and my wife. So, today's calendar or agenda is on the back of your schedule. It's the back of your third page of your description. So you'll see we're a small group, so we'll be flexible, but basically we'll have major presentation for an hour, then some Q&A, then 3 responses, and then Q&A with all of you, and then a final closing. So I want to just say a few words about our speaker, Professor Joshua Moritz. Joshua came to the GTU, was it 2001? He had graduated from Calvin College with a triple major, a BS in biology with a focus on evolutionary biology, a BA in European and Near Eastern history and archaeology with a focus on vertebrate archaeobiology, and a BA in classical languages. That's a mouthful. He entered with winning the Presidential Award in Scholarship for entering doctoral students. It's truly a high distinction. And he passed the special comps with distinction. That's a real challenge. Joshua's title is an amazing title of his dissertation. Think about this. Chosen from among the animals, the end of human uniqueness, and the election of the Imago Dei, the image of God. Really a stunning and challenging and revolutionary dissertation. One of the finest I've ever seen. It's truly something you want to look at. And then for now almost 15 years, Joshua has been the managing editor for our journal, Theology and Science. This is a world-class journal, and it's so much to Joshua's credit because he does all of the hard work to bring in essays, to help us decide amongst them, to work with authors, and to keep the journal on schedule. It's a fantastic job. I'm so grateful for it. And he's worked with me both in some of my own books, and then we published together. I'm very proud of this recent publication, God's Providence and Randomness in Nature, Scientific and Theological Perspectives. Does God act in the world? Is randomness a block to God's action, or is it the means? This book is a great combination of Josh's work and the other 12 scholars in the book. I'm very proud of that. Josh's own book, Science and Religion, Beyond Warfare and Towards Understanding, is one of the few and one of the most distinguished textbooks in the field. I urge you to get the book and read it as an entree into all the many aspects of theology and science. Joshua covers the entire landscape with brilliance and acumen, and he gives great discussion questions and sets you out on the course for deeper understanding. Joshua right now teaches at undergraduate students in philosophy at the University of San Francisco, right across the bay, and at the GTU. He is the director of Christian formation at Berkeley Covenant Church, where he teaches both adult and youth classes and works closely with the youth minister. I'm going to ask if folks from Berkeley Covenant could stand. We can welcome you with an applause for being here today. Thank you. Thank you for coming. I'm sure Josh was as pleased as I am. So on a personal note, I have had the incredible pleasure to know this man for going on 20 years now. one of the most erudite scholars I can think of. He's read everything, even before it's written. He remembers everything. I have to be careful. And he's a gracious critic, never dogmatic, always a Christian scholar, seeing the depths of the piece, of the issue, the way it's presented, and adding his own inimitable perspective on it. I've learned a tremendous amount from Joshua, both as a student and now as a colleague. I admire his faith. His family is fantastic. Melissa and Xavier. What a pleasure to have you here. You can be so proud of your dad. He really embodies the ideals of the Russell Family Fellowship, and he's a profound friend. Let me welcome Joshua Moritz.
Thank you so much, Bob, for your gracious and I had a tough time not being emotional during your words. So thank you, and thank you everyone for being here, for being part of this conversation. This is an important conversation for me, and I know for many of you. And this is a conversation about the future, and so. It's interesting that when I think about this topic and I think about timing and things like that, lots of emails, pastors who are doing Holy Week stuff, and lots of requests for the video. So I realize this conversation is a conversation that's going to be out there with dozens more that are in this room, at least who have requested the video. And I hope it's a conversation that continues beyond the confines of this room. So I will start the conversation. We'll have some respondents continue with the conversation. One of the youth that I've worked with, and Rochelle has worked with, has graciously come to share a few words too. So to keep us accountable, which is good. And we can start with a question. What does science do with youth ministry? On Wednesday I mentioned that this is a paraphrase of a guy named Tertullian, who was an early church father, who says, what has Athens to do with Jerusalem? What does the academy to do with the church? And his response is, nothing much really. Jerusalem's one thing, Athens is another. We have our own things to worry about in the church and don't need to worry about the academy. But I'm not asking this question in that way. My answer is going to be quite a bit. A lot is what science has to do with youth ministry. And I'll show you why as we talk about some data, as we talk about questions of authority, as we talk about who are the new icons and saints in the world of youth today. Does anyone recognize the saint in the stained glass window there? He's actually the devil on the bottom. Oh, this doesn't work there. The show Cosmos, if you've seen it, Neil deGrasse Tyson. Right? So two different images of who this guy is. Maybe you've seen the show, maybe not. But this is a sort of tension that we're going to articulate today when we talk about the role of science in youth ministry. How important is it to engage science in youth ministry? Is this worth our time to think about it? What about authority? What about the cost of ignoring science in youth ministry? What happens to youth when you ignore science? Or when you're anti-science, which is even worse in terms of the statistics that we're going to talk about. And then I'm going to give you advice. I'm going to be very practical and try to actually do something that few academics do, is actually talk about how to do this practically in a pedagogical sense. What's a way forward? And the steps I'm going to give you are grounded in lots of data, lots of sociological data, and also my own experience, which I'll talk about a bit on both sides of the divide between youth and college. And so I work with both. And I've seen a lot of accounts of faith changing or diminishing and the reasons why. So we can start with some data. Talked a lot about statistics on Wednesday. I'm not going to repeat those. But if you were there, you know that there's less biblical authority than there was in the 1970s. That quarter of Americans think the Bible is just a bunch of fables that are invented. Less than a quarter believes that you could trust the Bible, and 50% of Americans are in between. But everyone loves science, right? Or at least 80% of Americans see science as the highest authority in terms of public interest, in terms of what they say being true. The same group that's polled, and this is a Pew study in 2019 this year, says only 49% place confidence in religious leaders to be trustworthy, right? We're not talking about the Bible here, a much less percentage. If you look at people under 30, some of those numbers go down to 13% believe that Scripture is trustworthy. This is religious leaders. So these are just leaders. Almost 80% confidence in scientists, less than 50% confidence in religious leaders. If we talk about what science produces versus Scripture, those numbers are much more extremely skewed. We talked about those Wednesday, and they're in my paper. And at the same time, churches are noticing that lots of youth leave, starting at the age 15, and don't come back. Lots of these youth will leave in college. 60 to 90% of Christian young adults turn their back on faith in college. And in my paper, I think I cited about 12 different studies, which is where that range comes from. Some of those are just interdenominational studies or within one denomination like Southern Baptist. Others are more comprehensive, and you can look at those, and there's some websites there. 75% of Christian youth leave the church after high school, even when they don't go to college. And so it's not college. What's interesting, this data has shown, and follow-up studies have shown, it's actually not college that's the problem here, if you see this as a problem, right? One author of Psychology Today says, this is wonderful news, right? The Bible is losing authority. Youth are leaving the church. This is wonderful because all religion does is undermine science. And so this is a recent issue of Psychology Today. Sees this data as really good. If you're of that opinion, right, then a lot of this talk probably won't apply to you, but I'm guessing that's not where you're at. So I'm going to assume that you're wondering what reasons are youth giving for leaving the church starting at age 15. One major study done by the Barna Group, and David Kinnaman's the author of a book, You Lost Me, which we'll talk about, says issues of science are one of the significant points of disconnection between the next generation and Christianity. They did research following up on 59% of young Christians who disconnected after the age of 15, stopped going to church. So they followed up with them, did interviews, have a huge collection of data, and they're trying to find trends in these interviews and these conversations. And they found that with this group, they found 6 significant reasons why, and they post this they have this in their book, they post this on their website. If you look at the percentages, they don't put them in the order of the major percentages, which is interesting. But if you look at the percentages, you'll find that the number one reason is science. The number one reason youth give for leaving the church and not coming back has to do with science. Some responses they gave are 35% of this group said Christians are too confident that they know all the answers about science. And this is often in a young earth creationist context. Oh, well, you don't want to know the answer about this. I'm going to tell you it's right here in Genesis. End of discussion. The Bible says it. You believe it. That settles it. Churches are out of step with the scientific world we live in. 29%. Christianity is anti-science. 25%. And 23% turn off by the creation versus evolution debate. Other reasons youth give are doubt is another huge one. So the percentages on doubt are, again, around 35% that they feel the church is not a safe place for them to express intellectual doubts. And so a lot of these reasons actually have to do with these sorts of trends. And lots of data here we talked about on Wednesday, even more. But I'm going to switch so we can get to some more practical applications to my own experience on the other side of the youth divide. So I teach at USF. I've been doing that for almost 10 years, which is hard to believe, just shy of 10 years. And every class I have a homework assignment, a homework set. So first set, second question, I ask, do you believe God could exist? And do you think your belief is reasonable? And this is asked in different sorts of classes. Some of them are philosophy of religion. Some of them are great philosophical questions. And so there's a different group. But what's interesting is in a data set of over 1,000 that I have with this question, If I start going through it, these are pretty typical answers. Currently, I see no visible or immediately believable proof of any God, and there are scientific explanations for many things attributed to an almighty power. I was raised in a Christian household, but being a more rational person, I could not accept the explanations offered to me. And then when I look through this, the vast majority, I would say over 90% of the responses to this question cite something to do with science, either for belief or against belief. People who do believe in God still at this point, 17-year-old freshman or a sophomore or a junior or a senior, will often cite science in their belief about God. Here's one that does believe, which is interesting. You can see the trajectory here. I do believe that there could in fact be a God. I think my belief is rational and could be plausible. My belief is that there is a God, and that if there is a God, then he is the greatest scientist ever. Even though I grew up Christian, my belief is not that God is concerned with us as humans or that there's an afterlife. He created the world and the universe in his lab, and consequently all the physics around us, including us as well. What science is doing is gaining some of the knowledge that he already knows. Us being here are just the consequences of randomness, and he is not concerned with us. So you can see, here's a statement of belief, but the result is, well, science does not allow for a personal God, maybe a deistic God, a God who sets everything up, but not one who's continually active. The problem here is with miracles, and each of these students, this is the second week of the semester, and then we start to walk together to ask these questions and get to see where they end up at the end of a journey through a semester. Another student says, I grew up Christian, but I am now an indifferent agnostic. I have my doubts, but at this stage in life, I don't care if God exists or not. Perhaps this will change for me down the road. A lot of these students are very open. And think about this. These are students who are taking a philosophy class. They're at a Catholic university. USF is a Jesuit university. And so a lot of these are former Christians. Most of my students are former Christians, contemporary agnostics. I tend to side with YC as overwhelming tangible evidence favoring evolution. So he gives a specific reason. Theism lacks rational support because it has no empirical backing. It's all about science. Another student, I believe there could be God in the same way I believe it was actually Santa Claus putting those presents under the tree. In other words, I feel like the likelihood of God's existence is so extremely low, it's not even worth considering seriously, let alone worshiping. The student gives many scientific reasons, is a scientist himself, and has gone on to be a professional scientist. And we'll return to his story at the end because he's one that would show up to my office every day during office hours on Wednesday for 2 years even after I had him in class. And so we'll talk about him a bit more. So we have reasons. We have reasons from youth who've left the church. We have reasons from undergraduates that I've interacted with. And we can say, well, what about youth currently in the church? A study on Generation Z, as the Barna Group calls it, which are youth currently in the church, has found that more than 1/3 of engaged Christian teens, these are teens who see their faith of really high value and are really living out their faith, reading the Bible, praying, and having an active faith as engaged. And more than half of church-going teens, these are teens that go to church every week, right? These numbers, 37%, 53%, say the church seems to reject much of what science tells us about the world, and an even higher percent, though, think science is very important. And we can say, well, is this true? We can look at data like this, if you can read this chart. This is a group of American Protestant pastors, which is a representative survey across the board. And the question is, do you believe God used evolution to create people? Right? So God is in the picture, but evolution is also in the picture. And you can see that over 70% disagree with that, and only 12% strongly agree. And if you ask, well, what do younger people think about this question? You'll find that 73% of people under 30 in America strongly believe that evolution is part of the human story, how humans got there. So you can see a contrast, but then if you look even closer, only 4% of Protestant pastors with congregations over 250 accept evolution. Right? So if you're looking at mega churches, then the number goes way down. So we're talking about how much impact these churches have. only 4%, right? So 90%, 96% don't accept evolution. And so you can say, okay, well, is anyone taking science seriously as it concerns youth ministry? When I was looking, did some citations, or when I was doing Google searches for some of these Barna quotes to see if anyone has them in their books, this book came up, pouring in. I got a hold of it, started looking at it. This author starts chapters with quotes from the Barna data, but then goes on to reject science. It's a person who has no background in science. The background is a bachelor's in business administration, right? Hasn't worked with teens, but manages to get a book published, manages to become a popular book. I've seen on a number of church websites, and cites the data, but does not address science in any sort of responsible manner with any sort of background. And I think this exemplifies the problem in youth ministry today in terms of resources. There's not a lot out there. Greg has a wonderful book I want to plug on that. You're going to talk about your book a little bit?
I'll mention it.
Okay,
yes.
you'll mention it.
Yeah.
On youth ministry and science, mere Christianity?
Mere science and Christianity.
Mere science and Christianity, right? Talking about emerging adults, which is another word for youth. And there's another recent book, Andy Root. There's another book, and what's the title of that one?
It's like exploding
zombies
and dinosaurs.
Yeah. So it's a fictional book, but it has good footnotes. I haven't read it. I've looked at the footnotes. There's good footnotes. So I can't fully recommend it. But there's not a lot out there when you're talking about youth ministry and science. And we'll talk about some other books I'm not going to recommend. But the point is, when you look at interests of youth in science, you find most youth, the vast majority of youth, are interested in science. They're interested in pursuing scientific careers. Here's a study where 52% of the teens who were surveyed were interested in training for a science-related career. And these were youth group youth, right? So these are youth who are weekly attending a youth group. But in these same youth groups, science was talked about. Only 1% of these youth groups have talked about anything science-related in the previous year. Right, and actually, the group I work with was cited in the study as one of the 1%. Right, and so these are numbers that are disturbing to me. Only 1% of youth pastors talk about this at all in this survey, and why don't they talk about this? Because it's so important. I think this is the issue I want to touch on. Well, how can you talk about this? What can you do? What is the root problem? You could read books like this, Soul Searching, which looks at the National Study of Youth and Religion. It's a study that went from 2001 to 2015, done by folks at the University of Notre Dame, where they look at tons of data, they interview tons of youth, and they conclude that American middle schoolers preoccupied with smartphones, text messaging, and internet memes lose their religious faith owing to, quote, the influence of lingering cultural residues of intellectual doctrines that exhilarated science and philosophy in the 1880s and 1930s. And they continue with that thought, saying, ironically, at the same time that American teenagers are confronting the consequences of major contemporary technological revolutions in communication technologies, many of them also continue to assume popular but antiquated cultural mentalities about science and knowledge rooted in 19th and early 20th century thought, logical positivism, and naive empiricism. So they point out two cultural trends, and if you're reading this as a youth minister, you probably have not had a background in philosophy. So I read this book and I think, wow, it's good I have a PhD in this stuff because I understand the language, but what about someone who wants to access this who can't? I think this is part of the problem is translation. This is a great resource with lots of great data, but when you start to read it, there's a lot that's assumed. And so we can say, well, how do we translate this? How do we talk about this? There's been some attempts to acknowledging this data, right, to say, okay, well, you have science as a key issue in youth ministry. So then what do? And some say, well, maybe the answer is promote positivism. Positivism is a view of science that sees science as the number one authority, sees science as having all the authority, and that we should essentially just make science the only authority is the idea here. And I would say this idea is exemplified, if you ever heard of Science Mike, who's a celebrity blogger, right? He has a book called Finding God in the Waves and a podcast, and it's very popular, but you start reading his work and there's not much authority in Scripture, right? You can say, well, Scripture has the authority of any ancient work of literature, is Science Mike's view of Scripture. The miracles of the Bible, he has a Christmas sermon he gives where he talks about, virgin birth is impossible, and the angels, that could be explained by hallucinogenic mushrooms, and resurrection didn't happen, but if it touches you, if it's this touching story, then good for you. But science is the authority, because science is verifiable. You can verify science, you can confirm science. Science is objective, science is value-free. Science can tell us anything we ever need to know about everything. And that's a view called positivism. And when I'm feeling cheeky, I'll refer to him as Scientism Mike, because that's what I see when he's writing this and when he's talking about this. This is not an option if you're interacting with youth, because what you've just told them is your religion is pointless, right? If the Bible is nothing more than art, if religion has no authority over anything, and it's completely subjective, then why be there, right? So that's the message, I think, that comes from asserting positivism. You could call it science deified. That's what C.S. Lewis called it. Scientism is science deified. The belief that science will solve all problems and answer all questions. And this leads to the elimination of the human subject and the negation, I would say, ultimately, of human mural responsibility. And, I don't know if our ethicists want to pick up on that point. But the other tower, I have two towers here. One is the, Saruman. Sauron's the eye of subjectivism. Saruman is the new breed of orcs and the scientism, right? And Lewis and Tolkien talked about this a lot. So this actually shows up in Lord of the Rings and that hideous strength. These two, this is their fictional way of talking about these things. The other tower is subjectivism, which you find in postmodern approaches to the youth ministry. Here as my book, my example of this is Tony Jones' book on postmodern youth ministry, where it's all about the subject, and it's all about science is put at the same level as Scripture, and both are seen as essentially art, and neither has authority. The subject has absolute authority, and this is also not the way to go, as I argue in my paper, because if you're defying science in a generation that embraces science as their only authority, you've just defied their only authority, and also you're just going to push them out the door. Whether or not you believe postmodernism has a good point in critiquing science, I think there is value in that, but science does do something that other institutions don't do in terms of giving us knowledge. So I would argue for that in a philosophical point, but that's not the topic of today. There's resources if you want to look into that cited in the paper. What I want to do is talk about 9 steps to actually doing something about this, that I will go through some of them. Rochelle will talk about how we've practically applied these in the context of youth ministry at Berkeley Covenant Church. And step 1 is listening and learning where youth are at. And I have your youth. If you interact with youth, I think it's important to make that a personal conversation, not just, you can look at the statistics and say, oh, well, generally youth are at here, so I'm going to, 7 out of these 10 are going to love science. Which 7? Right? It might not always look like that, but it's a good guide. But have conversations. Sit down, have a coffee. Say, what are the issues in your life that are important? And listen, learn. Step 2, as you start to listen and learn, you're going to hear lots of false dichotomies. I guarantee it. And then you start exposing these. Help them to think, ask questions. God versus science on the cover of Time magazine. If you think about that for a second, Richard Dawkins versus Francis Collins. Wait, both are scientists. Francis Collins finished the Human Genome Project, but he happens to be an evangelical Christian, but he's one of the best scientists alive today. Richard Dawkins, he's also a scientist. Well, which is science? Which is God? Some people worship Dawkins as a god. Is he the God side? Is Collins the science side? Is it a false dichotomy? Faith versus fact. As if there's no role for faith in the development of what we call fact, right? Who here assumes the law of non-contradiction, right? Perhaps you do, perhaps you don't. Give me a good reason why without using the law of non-contradiction. Right? Well, that's where faith comes in. We have assumptions. Creation versus evolution. Evolution is an inherently theistic word. That means the unfolding, the revealing. Darwin actually didn't use evolution because it was loaded with religious teleology, religious purpose. Right? So he didn't like that term. So this is a word that has changed meanings, but even today you can think, well, is it not going anywhere? Do we know the laws of evolution? What about convergence? What about fine-tuning? There's so many aspects in evolution. It's a much bigger picture. So to say that they're automatically opposed is a false dichotomy. Miracles versus natural law. Originally, people thought God created these natural laws. And so how can you say, well, God created the laws that then God can't intervene with? Lots of false dichotomies all over the place, but thinking deeply about them. Viewing doubt as a doorway to deeper faith, I'll talk about more in a moment. Instructing youth on how to think critically and not simply what to think. I'll talk about that too. Teaching some history of science as it relates to faith. I'll go more into that one. And then step 6, introducing some philosophy of science in proportion to the stage and the age of youth. I'll talk a little bit about that, which has to do with what science is and what it isn't. Challenging widespread myths about the history and nature of science. I'll talk about that. Using creative mutual interaction as the method of choice. This is a method that Bob Russell has worked on and developed over many years. And you can see the citation where he talks about that. But a youth version of this is what I'm talking about in terms of this interaction. And step 9, seeking always to stay honest and humble. And that leads you into step 1, which is listening and learning. And this is a hermeneutical circle, if you know that phrase. Right? You can jump in at various places, but one step leads to the next, and then it leads back to the beginning, and you continue the circle in every context. And this is a law of ministering to youth. So in giving it an acronym, I thought it'd be appropriate to call it Leviticus. So all those letters line up to Leviticus. Right?
Good.
And so it's the law of ministry. That's what Leviticus means, pertaining to ministry, pertaining to priesthood. Right, so you can think about, okay, how do these steps work? I talked about the first 2, and I'll talk about step 3, viewing doubt as a doorway to deeper faith. The number 2 reason that youth give for leaving the church is that the church did not know how to handle their doubt. The church, they say, feels unfriendly to those who doubt. The church is not a place where you can ask your most pressing questions, where you can ask skeptical questions. 36% of the youth who left the church expressed this. When sincere doubts were expressed, these youth who left the church, felt that they had been offered slick or half-baked answers to their thorny, honest questions. And so walking with doubt, many churches want to be seeker-sensitive, which are folks who have good faith in the church and say, yeah, I want to be here and learn this truth. But I think churches need to be challenged to be more skeptic-sensitive, because there's many skeptics that feel like they have no place in the church. And if we think about this, you can say, well, where is it written? That's something the covenant tradition asks. And we can look at the questions that Thomas raised. When Jesus was risen from the dead, Thomas is there. He says, well, I'm not going to believe unless I see. And what did the other disciples do? They say, oh, get out of here, Thomas. You're a skeptic. We want nothing to do with you. Right? They walked with him. They were patient with him. Right? Maybe it raised some of their own doubts. What did Jesus do with Thomas? He showed him. He showed him what he needed to see to get to a deeper level of faith than the other disciples, to make the proclamation, my Lord and my God, which is something that none of the other disciples had made at that point. Right? So this doubt led him to an even deeper faith. Every doubt is an occasion for deeper faith. And one of my favorite authors, a guy named George MacDonald, he was a mentor of C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, a spiritual mentor. He lived before them. But he writes, a man or woman may be haunted with doubts and only grow thereby in faith. Doubts are the messengers of the living one to rouse the honest. They are the first knock at our door of things that are not yet, but have to be understood. And theirs in general is the inhospitable reception of angels that do not come in their own likeness. Doubt must precede every deeper assurance. So MacDonald is one who writes a lot about doubt. And if you read his novels, you find the constructive role of doubt in his characters as they grow in a deeper faith. And this is a sermon on Job. This reference is from a sermon on Job he gives in a book called Unspoken Sermons. And so doubt is a doorway to deeper faith. When people start doubting, then they start thinking critically. And this work in emerging adults has found that critical thinking is something that is in short supply today in terms of making decisions and how to make them. Souls in Transition authors Christian Smith with Patricia Snell say, the majority of emerging adults simply don't know how to think about things. On such matters, they are very often simply paralyzed, wishing they could be more definite, wanting to move forward, but simply not knowing how they might possibly know anything worthy of conviction and dedication. So they're looking at this research and they're finding that folks are afraid of making decisions, afraid, of hurting people, because there's so much information out there. How do you know what's right? You're overwhelmed with information from the internet. How can you possibly determine which information is right and which is not? So critical thinking is needed more than ever before. There's ways to do this. One way I do this is by looking at truth claims. I give you a citation for a standard list of ways of evaluating criteria for evaluating truth claims, things like logical consistency or agreement with science or personal meaningfulness or agreement with culture, things like that. And what I've done is in my philosophy classes and also when I work with youth, I see what folks rank as the number one criteria, and then we can go from there. If my first criteria for truth is different than someone else's first criteria for truth, well, that's going to be a different conversation. If we both say yes, we both like science is number one, then that's another sort of conversation. If we both say that Scripture is number one, then that's a different conversation. The point is listening, learning, getting them to think about their cognitive structure, getting them to think about how they think is the point of critical thinking. We can say a lot more on that. We're going to move on to history of science. Teaching some history of science. How do you do this? Well, you can start with resources that talk about history of science. I recommend some of those. Specifically as it relates to faith, the reason why for this is statistically, most youth and most undergrads see science as the number one authority in their world. This is the number one authority for testing truth claims. And this, when I ask undergrads, this is always number one for every single class, right? Regardless of how religious folks are. So you can guarantee that science is going to be important. It might not be number one for everyone, but statistically, it's always the top. So talking about what science is, where it comes from, if you're talking about science as it relates to faith, I think a good point to start, and this is a thesis I've sustained in a number of works. Here's a recent article in the Journal of Biblical and Theological Studies I wrote called The Christian Theology of Creation and the Metaphysical Foundations of Science, if you want to read a discussion like that. There's other things as well, but here's a physicist who's not a Christian who says science began as an outgrowth of theology, and all scientists, whether theist or atheist, accept an essentially theological worldview. That's Paul Davies, who's writing in a book called Are We Alone? And why would I say that? Well, if you look at the foundations of science, if you look at the history of science, if you look at who the scientists are, you will find that there's this overwhelming presence of Christian theology in Christians. There's two books where I talk about this. The Brill book is a lot more academic, as you can tell by the cover. The lower book is for undergraduates and talks about the same sorts of things. But you find the modern scientific method occurs within Christian mysticism, actually in the Middle Ages, the guy named Nicholas of Cusa. You find that concepts that have been foundational to the development of science arose within Christian understandings of creation. Things like the laws of nature are originally a theistic concept. The unity of physics, that the same physics in heaven should be the same as the physics on Earth, is something that goes back at least to Basil of Caesarea. The rationality of the cosmos goes way back. The intelligibility of nature, inertia, right? The principle of the conservation of momentum, right? Angular momentum with a spinning top was first described by Basil of Caesarea, right? Linear momentum is described later, and Galileo gets his idea of conservation of momentum from Basil of Caesarea, who lived in the 300s and was describing it as a theological way of understanding the unity of creation against Aristotle. There's a lot of work on that. If you want to start with my stuff, it's out there, but there's a lot of other stuff out there too. The point is, history of science is very friendly to faith. You can look at particular scientists. I listed as many as I can get on a slide, and then I'll say their contributions. Didn't put first names because I want to squeeze. Nicholas Steno, father of stratigraphy and paleontology. Blaise Pascal in chemistry. Johannes Kepler, Isaac Newton, Max Planck, Lisa Meitner, the mother of fusion. Faraday, Michael Faraday, Robert Boyle, Mary Anning, who was a paleontologist, William Buckland, Lord Kelvin, Gregor Mendel of genetics, Theodosius Dobzhansky, who was one of the key founders of the modern evolutionary synthesis, was a devout Eastern Orthodox Christian. Friedman and Lemaitre, our standard cosmological theory is the Friedman, Lemaitre, Robertson, Walker standard theory of cosmology. We call it the Big Bang Theory. Two of those letters are devout believers. Lemaitre was a priest. Alexander Fleming, I put him in there because there's a stained glass window with him in there. And Arthur Eddington, and Arthur Compton, Charlie Townsend, the laser, Francis Collins, Human Genome Project. George Ellis worked on black holes. These are the fields. I didn't put all the fields there, but if you think about, okay, well, we have all these major fields of science, things like chemistry, quantum physics, paleontology, Big Bang cosmology, modern evolutionary synthesis, genetics, discovery of penicillin, bacteriology, relativity theory. These are all very devout people contributing to these areas of science. And this list goes on and on and on and on. So to say that there's something inherently antagonistic in the relationship of faith and science is just not a very well-informed opinion, right? I don't think that's an opinion anyone has a right to. People say, I have a right to my opinion. Well, I don't think so, right? If you're going to say it publicly, I think there's more accountability that's needed. Philosophy of science, step 6. What is science? What is science not? I would start by saying scientific experiments can never confirm or verify a theory. This is the language Science Mike uses about science. Science confirms this. Science can verify this. Well, there's always an infinite number of experimental tests to be done to verify or confirm something. So it's impossible to confirm a scientific theory. That humbles science a bit. It doesn't mean that science isn't great knowledge, but it means it's not ever confirmed or verified. The highest truth status of any scientific theory, says philosopher of science Karl Popper, is not yet falsified despite our best efforts. We can falsify a theory, right? We can falsify something like geocentrism by data, but can we ever confirm a theory? The answer is no. There's always other models, other experiments to be done. So it's the best knowledge we might have in the moment, but science is always a moving target, and scientific facts do not stand still. I'll give you an example from recent history. In 1962, Francis Crick, who was the co-discoverer of the double helix, said an absolute law of science is the central dogma of molecular biology that says information goes from DNA to RNA to proteins to us, one direction only. That's it. It's a law of biology. Very strong terms, but what happened? Well, later on in the early 2000s, we found these different sorts of relationships. If you look at this image, you have arrows going back to the DNA, reverse transcription, RNA editing, and so on, methylation of the DNA. This is called epigenetics. And so epigenetics has completely messed up this idea of the central dogma to the point where folks will now say, well, it's no longer a law of biology. And I think, wait, is that because epigenetics is a miracle? Because it's violating a law of nature? So epigenetics is a genuine miracle because Francis Crick told us this is a law of nature, and epigenetics violates it. Or is it the case that this was never a law in the first place? And then you think for a second about this relationship. Wait, some scientist who's a brilliant scientist tells me there's a law of nature, and then within 60 years, that law of nature is violated by other science. How do I know whether we have any laws of nature at all? How do we know we have one good law of nature that we can say, yes, this is definitely a law of nature, and we can put our anchor in this, right? You can say, well, physics is where it's at. Quantum physics, our best physics that we ever could dream of. Laws of nature are statistical. They're based on probability. Well, that's not helpful if you're looking for absolute laws of nature. So where does that leave us? Well, it leaves us with a very different vision of science than logical positivism, and that's the point of this. The other part is myths. We find myths everywhere. This is another Barna book, David Kinnaman. These are the folks looking at this data. And they say things like Christianity and science have been at loggerheads for centuries. The specific scientific discoveries and theories at issue these days may be new, but the tension between the two systems of explaining life is not. Christianity and science have been at loggerheads for centuries, right? This is just assumed. They've always been fighting. This is something that everyone assumes, that there's always been this tension between science and the Christian faith. A very popular book in youth ministry, postmodern youth ministry, right? Tony Jones says one of the biggest blunders of the age of Christendom was the church's reaction to the Copernican revolution. Nicholas Copernicus and scientists who followed him, such as Galileo, stood on the crest of the wave of science that eventually brought Christendom to its knees. This is a very popular view of science and faith, but as we talked about Wednesday, the problem with this view is that the history is completely wrong, right? And you see this everywhere. I'm going to show you a brief video about why it's wrong, so you can see some authorities on the history of science talk about this, and then we will continue.
Between science and religion is like one of the oldest wars between man ever, and we're going to solve it tonight.
There are a lot of people out there who say you can't mix science and religion, they can't coexist.
Can a good scientist really believe in God?
Do any scientists believe
Looks like
in
they're just
God?
trying to get some publicity.
This battle,
Is it science versus God?
So then is science compatible with religion?
To find the origin of the conflict or warfare thesis for science and religion, we have to go to the late 19th century, particularly to two men, John William Draper, an English immigrant to the United States in the 1830s, first president of the American Chemical Society, and an amateur historian, and Andrew Dixon White, a senator in the New York legislature and first president of Cornell University. Each of them wrote a book on the conflict, in the case of Draper, or the warfare of science and religion, in the case of White. They gave this historical view that science and religion have always been at odds. The impetus behind both of these is not particularly historical. It's rooted in political and social events of the time. The real reason that White was writing is he says that he was reacting against sectarian, that is, denominational Christian attacks on the founding of Cornell University as a non-sectarian institution. The problem is that these attacks are actually rather difficult to identify what exactly they were. And if we scratch the surface, what we see is, in fact, political maneuvering and fighting over federal dollars.
He tells Cornell at the time that he's going to give his opponents a lesson which they will remember. So he goes on a crusade to paint the existing scholars and attitudes of the old liberal arts colleges, the denominational colleges, as backward, and his own ideas as progressive. Draper has a somewhat different agenda. He does use the word conflict in the title of his book, but he's not focused on refuting traditional Christian theology. He simply wants to indict the Catholic Church for abuses of power.
The problem with the books is that they're terrible history. The historical facts, that's very generous to call them facts, are cherry-picked or contorted, taken out of context in order to promote the author's main ideas about this perpetual warfare between science and religion. The word scientist is only created in the 1830s. Draper and White are part of this professionalization of the sciences, and so they're carving out a niche, a social niche, a political niche for the scientist, the person who does the sciences. A fundamental piece to understand is that we cannot look at the past as if it were divided into the scientists and the religionists. For most of history, those people were one and the same. There were not two camps.
In the 17th century and the 16th century, that's the period of time that historians usually call the scientific revolution. Nearly all of the major scientists were Christians, quite a few of them very devout. An example here would be the life and work of Robert Boyle. Boyle was a major figure in what we call today chemistry. He was one of the founders of the modern scientific method and enterprise. Boyle calls the world itself a temple, and he sees himself as a priest in that temple.
He liked to do chemical experiments, particularly on Sundays, because he felt they were a kind of devotion. He argued that being devoted to the study of nature made one a better Christian, not a worse one. But there are lots of other cases. Nicholas Steno, who enunciated the fundamental laws of geology about strata, who was a convert to Catholicism, became a priest and then a bishop.
Johannes Kepler, he sees science as a religious activity.
His idea was that by discovering the mathematical relationships between the times of a planet's orbit around the sun, he was revealing the eternal mathematical principles by which God made creation. The Catholic Church was probably the greatest patron of the arts and sciences that the world has ever known. Jesuits in particular were foundational in optics, magnetism, of seismology. Likewise, we can go to medicine, where hospitals and medical work was the province of the church. So a lot of medical innovation and investigation was done in religious centers for most of the last 2,000 years.
The idea that science and religion have been always involved in this inevitable conflict is not true.
Yet, the legacy of these two books, of these two men, are foundational. Journalists tend to take the Draper and White theses of conflict or warfare between science and religion as the fundamental starting point for everything else. So even 150 years after these books were published, and after a time when people no longer actually read them, they have given the stage direction, so to speak, for scientists and religionists to attack each other. The kind of struggles are not really with each other, but with the difficulty of understanding. And once we realize that, I think we'll have a much more positive alliance rather than warfare between the two, without the detriment to either, but the benefit to both.
So we have a story that's different than the story that most people hear, right? You can think about the story of science and religion always being at war, and then you can look at, well, who studies science and religion? Who are the scholars in this? And you find a unanimous understanding among them. Principe, who's a Johns Hopkins professor in both the chemistry department and in the philosophy of science department. He has multiple PhDs, right? He says, well, there's not one professional historian of science who would say that there's ever been a war between science and religion. And so as an accomplished scholar, he will make that claim, and he's not alone. But yet, we find myths, false myths everywhere that these scholars are trying to put to rest. Things like that medieval Christianity was inhospitable to science. The idea of the Dark Ages is a complete myth. The church banned human dissection. Actually, the church, particular popes, encouraged human dissection. That pope, one of them you find in Draper and White, is Pope Calixtus III, excommunicated Halley's Comet. Right? Why would a pope excommunicate a comet? Doesn't matter. It's not true. There's no historical basis for it. That people used to believe in a flat earth never happened in the Middle Ages. No one at the time of Columbus thought the earth was flat. That's a contemporary problem, not a medieval problem. Heliocentrism was resisted because it demoted humans from the center of the cosmos. There's no historical evidence for this in terms of the time of Copernicus or beforehand. Galileo was tortured and imprisoned by the Inquisition. Some would even say executed. Again, a complicated story, but this is not true in this version of it. If you want the details of Galileo, I can give you lots of references, including the stuff I've written about it. The church opposed vaccination, anesthesia. Darwin's origin was met with universal resistance from Christians. Some of the biggest promoters of Darwinism, like Asa Gray, were evangelical Christians. Gray was a professor at Harvard as well as a scientist. And so these are some of the myths. You see them in books like this. Dan Brown, Angels and Demons, that's fiction. There's a whole history of the concept of zero that condemns the church for banning zero, which never happened. Atheist Universe, which is the Thinking Atheist book, has a lot of these myths. I actually taught a whole class where I think I started with the Atheist Universe. Here's a claim, and we're going to tell you why it's completely false. And that class is online. If you're looking for resources, you can watch those lectures. The point is, challenging myths is important because a lot of people coming into your church or into your context are going to be believing these myths because they're all over the place. And there's resources to do this. You don't have to take my word for it. There's plenty of scholars out there who have spent their lives doing this. There's a Harvard professor who has spent her whole life trying to undo the whole church banning human dissection myth, and named Catherine Park. And she has several books, and she interviewed by the New York Times. She says, I don't understand why I can't make a dent in this myth. Right? There's stuff that's been complete church councils that were cited by Draper and White that are completely invented, never even happened. Right? They're ghosts, literary ghosts, but yet you can't put these myths to rest. That's on the, you might say, defensive side, right? Trying to clean up what's wrong, but then finding a positive interactive side is the other part of it. And this is where creative mutual interaction comes in. When you have something that comes from faith or theology and something that comes from science, how do you bring them into conversation? Right? How do you bridge science and religion where both parties have something of value to contribute? Right? We can talk about the creation of the universe as a good example. And you say, well, how do we interpret, how do we understand the Big Bang, which is a beginning of the cosmos, with the idea that there's a beginning in this Jewish and Christian understanding of the cosmos, and Islamic as well, right? But if you're looking at your scriptures, and you're thinking, okay, well, we have this beginning, how do we make this make sense? There's many practical ways to do this, but to start thinking about this conversation means, first of all, doing your homework, taking the science seriously, but I would say also taking your scriptures seriously. If you're in the Christian tradition, that means going back to Hebrew and Greek. Sometimes the simplest thing to do is just put some Hebrew up there and talk about the range of meaning of the various words in Hebrew. And that gives us a certain humility when we think about, well, what is the range of meaning? This is, oath, right? Bird, insect in Deuteronomy and other places. Flying things generally, right? So flying things versus birds when you're reading the Genesis account. there's a lot more variety. We tend to pigeonhole these words because of textual traditions, but the Hebrew text is actually much broader. So you can say, well, we don't actually know exactly what it means. Maybe that might disturb some folks in the church, that we don't actually have full control over this text. But we can open up the text through its original languages to be a bit more humbled by it in the way that we're humbled by the universe. And what this does is it builds what's called cognitive resistance to modern secular assumptions. This is from the work of Smith and the folks at Notre Dame with the National Youth Survey in Religion. They say this is extremely important in fostering religious commitment during emerging adulthood for nourishing meaningful lifelong religious faith. They say if you want youth to continue faith, you have to give them the skills to have cognitive resistance to assumptions that are out there. Get them thinking their own thoughts, but especially in different terms. Miracles is very important in this, actually. Belief in miracles helps to build cognitive resistance when it's done in a way that meaningfully talks about laws of nature and modern science, which is some of the finding. Last step is seeking honesty and humility. And this is, I think this is in some ways the most important step. You know, we could put this as one, but this is the one that leads into listening and learning. And we can think about this question for us, right? I could ask for a show of hands. How many here think that you know a truth that is worth telling someone else? Anyone think they know something true that's worth telling to someone else? Pastor Andrew, nothing worth preaching about, right? No hand. But you might have something you think is worth telling, some sort of truth. And you can think about your own truth. How many here believe that you know the limits of your own intellect and knowledge? Have you ever thought about the limits of your intellect?
Can we say some limits?
Some limits? Yeah. And so that process of seeking out your limits, this is what intellectual humility is about, right? It's assessing the limits of your own intellect and knowledge, realizing there's a lot more I don't know than what I do know. I used to have a Greek professor that would tell me, I've forgotten more Greek than you will ever know. And I believe that was true, right? Because the things he knew, I mean, he could read these ancient inscriptions and do amazing things in Greek. And I never got, to that level of being a professor in Greek in multiple, the whole history of Greek, right? I could read different periods of Greek, but to have that level, but he's forgotten so much. And so realizing, well, I don't know as much as I think I know, that should humble me, and that should humble everyone. Science is awfully a humbling process. It doesn't always do that. Most people who are doing the actual, front lines research are usually more humble than those who write about science and think they know something about science. But the limits of knowledge, limits of intellect, this is essential. There's a recent book on intellectual humility as an approach to the philosophy of science, that all scientists need this in order to pursue science. And this is, they argue this is essential for scientific investigation. I would argue that this is also essential for understanding any genuine encounter with God, for understanding God's truth, you can say. And I'm not alone in that. Someone once said, truly I tell you, one will never enter the kingdom of God unless they're willing to change and turn back and humble themselves like a child who is just beginning to listen and learn. That's my very literal translation. The word there for child is someone who's just beginning in pedagogy, right? A child in training. And so I think this is an appropriate place to end when we're thinking about youth, right? In order to enter the space of humility, we have to be like a little child. We have to think, okay, maybe what I've learned isn't as impressive as what I think. And that will put me into interaction with other folks and in conversation with all these different sources. And then we're having that conversation together. And so these are the steps that I've used in my own teaching, in my own work in youth ministry. And I found them effective. They continue the story of the guy who said there's not a God, or the likelihood of God is as likely as that of Santa Claus. In October 2018, I received a message from a person. This is Michael Jones, does videos. he does videos on miracles and science, and this is one of his videos where he cites me as a talking head, sort of talking about miracles and quantum physics. I'm talking about how quantum physics is statistical and tying that into the question of laws of nature. And right, he's a very popular YouTube video creator, 82,000 subscribers at this point. I think that number's up to 90,000 subscribers. And right, and this video alone had something like 27,000 views, which is more. I think if I put a video, the video of this will probably have 10 views or something like that, maybe more, hopefully more. The point is, because he likes my stuff, he asked me to be his Facebook friend, like you do, and then he saw this posted on his miracles video. Joshua Moritz was my professor and helped me to bring me out of atheism. And this is the student who talked about not believing in God or God being at the same level of Santa Claus, right? That would meet me every Wednesday and we'd have this conversation. And I had no clue that at this point, he wrote me an email right around the same time that said, by the way, I wanted to thank you because I think you inadvertently turned me into some kind of Christian, right? And, among other things he was saying. And so going through these steps, right, mentoring this college undergraduate who had left faith because of science, but then, and had really loved Richard Dawkins and Bill Nye the Science Guy and all these popular voices of science, but then coming back through the process of exposing myths, through the process of teaching some philosophy of science, through the process of looking humbly at where our authority comes from and listening. Where are you at? What are your questions? What are the things that really the stumbling blocks? This process works, and we can talk about its truth value. I also believe all these things are true. I wouldn't be saying them if I didn't. But these are the steps that I'm offering to anyone listening or watching, and I'm always a resource that's available as well. So I'm not going to disappear anywhere. If you're interested in continuing this journey with me, I am certainly happy to walk with you on this. So thank you, everyone.